Well, I guess we can talk a little bit about why we have Oromo protests and like kind of the history.
Exactly. So I think one thing that's really important for anyone who's interested in learning more about the Oromo people and particularly this Oromo protests movement is to understand the context behind it, the context in Ethiopia and the context of Ethiopia. And I suppose to give a very brief summary, and I mean very brief, um, Ethiopia is historically and arguably to this day a colonial empire. This is something that a lot of people don't necessarily know about Ethiopia or recognize about Ethiopia. But modern Ethiopia, as we know it today, was established based on colonial imperialism. Um, so the Oromo nation and many other nations that are a part of Ethiopia today were colonized. So their lands were colonized and they were forcibly incorporated into Ethiopia. And as with most colonial empires, that involved a lot of violence, a lot of oppression, a lot of marginalization, um, murder, and just downright genocide.
Hmm.
And this is something that was suffered by not only the Oromo, but many of the nations and nationalities within Ethiopia. Um, and as another symptom of this colonial empire, another facet or factor in this colonial empire was that these nations and nationalities, including the Oromo, had anything that had to do with their identity oppressed and marginalized too. So cultural identity, religious identity. The Oromo people, for example, have an indigenous faith system, which is known as Wakefana or Wakefata. And that alongside the Afan Oromo language and alongside many Oromo cultural practices, including an indigenous Oromo governance system known as the Gada system, which is one of the world's most ancient democratic systems. Um, that the Oromo used to rule and govern themselves, all of these things became forbidden and outlawed in Ethiopia, and became a source of persecution or a reason for persecution of the Oromo people. So as Oromos, we relate very differently to a lot of the figures that are upheld. And I say this because, you know, we're speaking on a Black Lives Matter platform. And so there'll be lots of people from different Black backgrounds and different diaspora backgrounds listening to this. So we as Oromos relate very differently to a lot of the figures from Ethiopia, Ethiopian historical figures that are upheld as champions of Pan-Africanism or upheld as these figures of Black excellence, and you know, as representatives of you know, sort of uh, Black freedom and sovereignty as such. For example, Emperor Haile Selassie, he's, you know, very well known generally. You know, across the world among black communities, and he's someone that the Oromo people relate to very differently because he was a person who severely oppressed and persecuted and harmed the Oromo people and many other nations and nationalities too. Um, so I
Yeah,
don't know.
and I
I guess
think just generally speaking as well, we just relate differently to the whole Ethiopian identity as well. And
yeah,
generally speaking, Oromo people have not been represented in that identity. And
no,
you know, it's kind of crazy if you think about it that the largest nation within Ethiopia is not has never been like represented or anything within that identity. And if anything, that identity has been imposed on Oromos. And through that imposition, also there has been that attempt to strip away our own unique identity and what brings us together.
Mm-hmm.
And really, that has been a theme in Ethiopia throughout multiple regimes in the past. The previous regime, was very, brutal. And so in just to talk about Oromo protests a little bit, around 2014 to 2018, there was a very strong grassroots youth-led movement of Oromo protests. And that actually ended up kind of bringing down the last regime. And supposedly in 2018, there was this idea that, okay, the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, was supposed to lead reforms in the country. But unfortunately, that facade really only lasted a few months, and then we started seeing what he was really up to. And now, unfortunately, we're back in the same place as where we were. And it's so sad to see because of how many youth like sacrifice their lives, really just risking their lives to protest and say like, we're fed up with this and we want our rights to our land, to have, control over our own country and who we are. Because really that's what Oromo protest is all about. It's about, not having that Ethiopian empire. We say empire because like really it's still acting like an empire. Cannot take our land and take it away from Oromia and continue to break down what Oromia is. Cannot, impose, other practices on us, and that we should be able to, like the people of Oromia should be able to determine what they want for their country and what they want for their people. So self-determination is incredibly important. And then, yeah, just like a say over our own land and who we are and the right to exist as ourselves. And this is very much like a pro-democracy movement. Like Hangatu said, like Oromia is, where one of the world's oldest democracies came from. And so that's at the core of who we are as a people. And so really that's what the movement is all about.
Exactly. It's to kind of create that space for Oromo people, like you say, to exist as Oromos within Oromia. And actually, someone asked a really interesting question, which is understandable. Which understandable considering how large of a nation we are. And they asked, how come Oromos haven't been represented when they're one of the largest groups in the country? And that's a very fair question to be asking. And the answer to that is very complex. But again, it's rooted, excuse me, it's rooted in the fact that Ethiopia is a colonial empire. So when Oromia was colonized by so the first emperor of Ethiopia as we know it today was Menelik II, and the Oromia, or the Ethiopia that we know today was founded by him in, I believe, 1889. And so when Oromia became colonized, one of the ways that was used to maintain the empire was to suppress the Oromo people. And this was through extreme violence. Yeah, someone's just commented systemic oppression. Exactly, it's systemic oppression. So that systemic oppression was established through the use of extreme violence. And that extreme violence became the foundation of that oppression. And anything that was seen as defining of being Oromo, the language, the culture, the religion, all of that became a reason for being persecuted. And embracing this, we use this term called Oromumma, which is what's to which is what we say to describe the Oromo identity. So anything that could be considered an emblem of Oromuma became a reason for oppression. And that oppression was built into successive Ethiopian political systems, moving from when it was an empire to when it became a sort of Marxist regime under the Derg. And then again, moving into when it was supposed to transition into a democracy in the early 90s. That transition never really took place. It was just a sort of, surface change. But ultimately, Ethiopia continued to function as it had when it was an empire.
Yeah. And I
So,
think it's also important to note like the amount like the it is absolutely systemic, and it's large scale, and the ways in which that suppression has occurred has shifted over the years.
mm,
And right now, one of the things that we are facing is the large scale propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. And I think that's also really important to notice as well, because again, we're talking about a country that is a dictatorship that, first of all, the prime minister is no longer operating constitutionally. He has indefinitely postponed elections and is continuing to impose his ideology across the country, and really is at war with not only the region that a lot of people are hearing about in the news, Tigray, but also in Oromia and other areas. But it just looks different in different areas. Um, and yeah, so I think that's also important to note because people might see like really confusing information out there. But really, unfortunately, the government and the state media perpetuate this propaganda, and then that gets taken and disseminated um, very widely. So
yeah.
it makes it hard to get accurate information. And then on top of that, the government has shut down internet and phone lines in a lot of areas in the country. And so journalists can't do their jobs independently. And, you know, it's it's honestly very, very difficult to get accurate information about what's going on.
Mm. It is extremely difficult. There are people who aren't able to reach their family members, reach their parents, reach their siblings, reach their cousins, because the Ethiopian regime has imposed this communications shutdown in certain regions in Ethiopia, particularly the Tigray region and areas in Oromia as well. And this is where the federal government is cracking down the hardest on the civilian population, and therefore don't want their crimes against civilians to be known outside of where it's happening. Um, so
Can I address
we,
something that's in the comments?
yeah, of course,
Without like
please go
naming any names, I think there's some people that are spamming us, but there's like a little
ahead.
back and forth going on about whether Abi is Oromo.
Uh,
But yeah, I mean, there's even trolls in here, exactly. As
yeah,
Howie
yeah.
said, the disinformation campaign is rampant. Trolls even came into educational lives to spew
Wow.
misinformation. Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
without directly, because I'm not going to be addressing like people who are just here to spam us or troll us, but
Yeah.
I saw multiple people commenting about whether certain leaders, including Abiy or Oromo, and that's not the point. That's never been the point. The purpose of
Yeah.
Oromo protests was never we need an Oromo in office. The point was that Oromos deserve the right to self-determination and to determine their own future, and to be able to live in their own identity. And that is such a crucial thing in all of this. A lot of this is really ideological, whether the different nations and nationalities that have been incorporated into Ethiopia can actually exist as they want to be, and to, like I said, have their self-determination, which actually is a constitutional right.
Mm,
Or the other, another group that wants to impose their own vision of what Ethiopia is, one language, which is not the language of all the nations and nationalities. And yeah, so I needed to make that distinction. It doesn't matter if he's Oromo or half Oromo. It doesn't matter because at the end of the day, his interests are not with what the Oromo nation wants. If there is a non-Oromo leader that actually values democracy and allowing people their rights, that would be immensely better than anyone Oromo who doesn't value people's rights.
exactly, exactly. And further to that point as well, there are, I mean, if say Abiy was supposed to be representing Oromo interests, how would you then justify the fact that he has imprisoned unlawfully the most potent Oromo political opposition that he has? There are Oromo political leaders that are widely popular within Oromia, within the Oromo nation, that are currently in prison because they are a threat to Abiy and his power. And it's not only Oromo political leaders who are in prison. There are political leaders from many other nations and nationalities who have been in prison too. But those that he felt most threatened by, based on their representation of the Oromo people, he imprisoned. And he's kept them unlawfully imprisoned since, when did he imprison them? Back in July?
So yeah, June
Exactly.
30th,
Oh, right, precisely.
starting
So they've
then.
been Exactly. So they've been unlawfully imprisoned since the end of June. So the fact that Abiy is supposedly Oromo has absolutely nothing to do with the situation in Ethiopia, and it doesn't have any bearing on the desires of the Oromo nation whatsoever. And actually, to the question that somebody posed earlier again about, Oromo representation and why, and the sort of around the repression of Oromos and the visibility of Oromos in Ethiopia, in the Ethiopian space, across all different facets of Ethiopian society. Take somewhere like South Africa, for example, where during apartheid, you had a very small minority of Europeans who were able to suppress the entire Black South African nation. So systemic oppression and systemic marginalization doesn't really have anything to do with the size of the oppressed and the size of the oppressor. It's about the system that is in place to benefit one group and disadvantage another group. And that is the reason why Oromos have suffered under successive regimes in Ethiopia, because the system was built upon our exploitation. The system was built to maintain us in a subdued, maintain the Oromo nation in a subdued state, for the benefit of a minority, for the benefit of a small elite. And I think that's something that many countries around the world can relate to. So, especially as Black people, we can understand the idea of systemic and systematic oppression, exclusion and marginalization and persecution. And that's what the Oromo people have lived with and have suffered from the inception of the modern Ethiopia as we know it today, until now, under the dictator that is Abiy Ahmed. But shall we take it back a little bit and kind of talk about the Qerro and Karre movement, and how they sort of laid the foundations for the Oromo protest, and that they are the sort of the heartbeat, the grassroots of the Oromo protests movement?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Qerro and Karre, the meaning of the word Qerro, shall we define what Qerro means first and foremost?
Sure.
But I'm gonna need you to help me on this. Ghetto just means youth, right?
Yeah, I mean, so technically, Kero means like a young man, and Kadre is like a young woman. Like, yeah, but now with the whole movement, it's kind of become a broader term. Like
Yeah.
Ero, it's really like, yeah, it's kind of a broader term that has come to mean like youth, and particularly like the youth that have been really sacrificing their lives and safety for Oromo protests and for, our people. So,
Hmm. Exactly. So the Ghetto and Ghetto movement pretty much took hold for the most part under the previous regime. Under the previous Ethiopian regime, which was the EPRDF TPLF regime. Um, and during that regime, there was something that was called the Master Plan. And the Master Plan was an attempt to expand the capital city of Finfinne, which is Addis Ababa. But in Afan Oromo, the name of that city is Finfinne. So the master plan was an attempt to expand Finfinne into the rural surrounding areas, which would have led to the displacement of a vast amount of Oromo farmers. So Finfinne is in Oromia. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I think you were getting to it. I just
Oh,
wanted to
okay, yeah.
clarify for the listeners that like Finfinne is in Oromia, like literally all around it is Oromia, but it is considered, a federal, um, yeah, go
A federal
ahead.
region. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah, it's
considered a
considered like
federal
a
region.
separate, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
It's
it
not
isn't
considered by
administered.
the government to be Oromia region. It's considered to be a separate entity.
Entity. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So Finfinne isn't administered by the Oromia regional state. It is administered by the federal government. And so the master plan was an attempt to expand that federally administered region beyond what it was, and in the process of that, displacing a large number of Oromo farmers from their ancestral indigenous lands, and destroying their livelihoods in doing so. And so the Kero and Karo movement rose up as a movement to oppose the master plan. It rose up as a movement to stand against the expansion of the Finfinne area, and that then built momentum and grew into a movement that became about democracy, that became about toppling the repressive regime that had been in power for 27 or 28 so years in a supposedly democratic country. And the Guerro and Carre movement was successful in doing so. From standing against the master plan, it was able to topple the undemocratic and repressive regime of Ethiopia. It was able to topple an entire government. And this was in the favor of all of the people of Ethiopia. And then there was supposed to be, this happened, so the master plan was proposed when? In 2014 or so?
I don't know the exact year
Yeah,
question.
it was around that time, I think around 2014. So I think going from around 2014 until 2018, the Ghetto and Kadra movement were able to stand against peacefully. This was a peaceful protest movement, a grassroots movement where young people, young Oromo men and women, were putting their lives on the line for the sake of their freedom, and for the sake of their liberties. as Ethiopian citizens. And then in 2018, we're able to bring about the deposing of the EPRDF and TPLF regime. And that is when the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, was able to come to power. Um, so I guess that kind of explains where what the Ghetto and Gado movement is and where they started from, and that this Oromo protest platform developed as a sort of an online representation, an online voice for the Ghetto and Gado.
Yeah, and how we added, and empty condos are still being built on Oromo land, leaving farmers in complete destitution. Absolutely.
But
Yeah, thank you everyone who's showing solidarity and understanding or trying to understand, what this movement is all about.
mm,
Appreciate that.
yes, most definitely. And we hope that we're kind of able, to those of you who weren't aware, we hope that we've been able to kind of bring a different perspective on Ethiopia, and how many of the people within Ethiopia itself actually relate to the state of Ethiopia. I think there's a lot of work to be done to kind of debunk some of the myths about Ethiopia, that float around, in generally in the sort of in the Black community around the world, and bring a more nuanced understanding as to what Ethiopia actually is, and how it actually is to its own people, and its own citizens. But I guess, shall we talk a bit about the sort of latest iteration of the Oromo protest then, and how things have picked up again since June and July this year,
Yeah,
because
sure.
we've
So as we kind of mentioned before, the Oromo protest movement, from like 2014 to 2018, was really like a huge factor in the subsequent events. And then over the past couple of years with Abiy in power, unfortunately, in that really short time, I mean, this is someone who just a year ago won the Nobel Peace Prize. And, even at that time, there was already controversy that he really was not deserving of that prize. But then
no.
since then, things have just gone completely downhill. That has been a license for him to really go to war on all, essentially, at the core of this, there's an ideological war. And as we mentioned before, Abiy Ahmed and his supporters are trying to impose that old vision of Ethiopia where everyone speaks one language and has one culture and one identity. And then the vast majority of the country is, values self-determination and their own rights as nations, and feels that that's the only way for these nations to coexist because people do not want to be, you know, they don't want to assimilate to the colonial identity. And so he has been very brutal. There has been occupations in multiple areas of Oromia, um, state-sanctioned killings, and then things have really shifted ever since June. On June 29th, the Oromo artist and activist Hachalu Hundessa was murdered. We still don't know the events that transpired because there has not been any investigation. And unfortunately, his assassination was completely politicized. And then the government immediately used this as a pretext for jailing opposition leaders and, also just regular people.
Mm,
There was a massive crackdown on all forms of dissent, protests, anything like that. and things have just been getting worse and worse by the day. Kids, children, well, I just said the same thing, but yeah, women, it's just youth, elderly, everyone. So there is no justice for Hachalu Hundessa to this day. And then, you know, there are so many tragedies that have occurred since then. And
Mm,
then now in the news a lot is the war on Tigray. And so that really is a continuation of the war that has been going on in Oromia and then in a lot of the southern nations and nationalities as well.
mm,
And that war has been kind of taken a different shape, obviously, because the TPLF had, you know, like a strong military, and so that became like a full-blown military conflict.
mm.
And yeah, but it's important to see that in the context of what's going on and what Abiy and his supporters are trying to do in the country.
Exactly. The civil war that's being waged against the people of Tigray is an extension of the war that Abiy has been waging in Oromia for the last 2 years. There are thousands of Oromo people who are currently in prison for having peacefully protested against Abiy's persecution. Against them, against Abiy's persecution of Oromo people and of people of other southern nations and nationalities, and now of the people of Tigray. And like you said, this is rooted in an ideology of his, wanting to return Ethiopia to this centralized unitary state, stripping the nations within Ethiopia of the small gains that they've made in terms of being able to secure some level of self-determination and some level of autonomy. And we have to remember again that the context for this is the fact that Ethiopia, the colonial empire of Ethiopia, was never dismantled. So the structure of Ethiopia today is still that of the colonial empire. So the people, the nations within Ethiopia today are still striving to become decolonized. And there are different frameworks within this, in terms of how this could take place. And the federalist system that exists now is one of those frameworks that has been attempted to give the nations of Ethiopia back some of their autonomy, to give them back some of their self-determination, and to return some level of sovereignty to them. And so, there are those who oppose the federalist system or any other form of self-determination for the nations in Ethiopia. And to oppose it, to kind of give it a different kind of sort of paradigm, or to put it in a different context, to oppose that, if you think about it, is similar to opposing the dismantling of the British Empire, or opposing the dismantling of the Portuguese Empire or the French Empire. All of these Western nations that had empires and colonized lands in Africa, it's a given to people today that empires like that shouldn't continue to exist. And the only solution to empires like that is to return the autonomy of the nations, to return autonomy to those nations, to return self-determination to the peoples who were colonized. So it's, it's like, it's something that I think people struggle to wrap their head around sometimes, because when we talk about colonization and when we talk about imperialism, it's generally understood as it's generally understood in the context of Western colonization, of Africa, of the Americas, in Asia, etc. But this is essentially the same thing. It's just that it's Africans who have colonized other Africans. But ultimately, the system, the method, and the structure is exactly the same. And the means through which it was achieved is exactly the same, through military force. And in fact, the Menelik II, who was the founder of modern Ethiopia, used British arms to colonize the nations that are within Ethiopia today. So British arms were used to colonize the Oromo nation. So there has been Western involvement in the colonization that led to the formation of Ethiopia as well, and so this idea that Ethiopia was never colonized, and the fact that Ethiopia is held up as this representation of black power, or whatever it is, as a country that was never colonized. Well, it may not have been colonized from the outside, but it is an imperial colonial. It's a colonial empire within itself, that was founded with the help of Europeans. So Europeans helped to found the Ethiopian empire.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of shifting people's sort of understanding of what Ethiopia is, and bringing in this sort of other perspective. Oh God, there are so many trolls up in here.
If I can tie it to Black Lives Matter a little bit,
Yeah.
I really, really appreciate you hosting today, and I really appreciate Black Lives Matter Sweden for giving this platform, and having you host, because I think this is really important. And and I'm sure you relate to this, and a lot of people watching relate to this, but as an Oromo living in diaspora, and as a Black person, and as a Black woman living in, the Western world, a lot of these sentiments, regardless of the fact that the context is very different, the sentiments that both of these movements, the way that I relate to them is so similar. And even me at a Black Lives Matter protest, I feel it the same way that I feel, an Oromo protest. And it's when you really think about it, at the core, it's about that, simply wanting to exist peacefully and truly as your own self, without having, some other ideology or perspective or anything really imposed upon you. And I think that's really that's what we mean when we say self-determination. It's having your rights over your own self. And yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I feel like there are a lot of similarities in that sentiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Having the right to be your own self in your indigenous
Mm-hmm.
lands,
Yeah.
where your ancestors are from,
Mm-hmm.
where everything about you originates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even just the concept of the constant gaslighting and the constant, you know, like somebody telling you that you're racist because you want acknowledgement for of who you are and you want to be who you are. Like it's just it's absolutely mind-boggling.
It
And
really is.
it's like really so many aspects of this, there are a lot of parallels. And so yeah. And the thing is, like Oromo protests is not like an Oromo like supremacy type of thing. Like we
God,
stand with all nations and nationalities against state violence. We stand with all
exactly.
nations and nationalities in their fight for self-determination. And so
Exactly.
I think that's important to know as well.
Yeah, that's very important to know. And it's also important to understand that the Kero and Kare movement and the Oromo protest movement has been so heavily demonized, and so heavily lied on in
Mm-hmm.
so many ways to
Mm-hmm.
try and paint it as a movement that is destructive, or to try
Mm-hmm.
and paint it as a movement that is sort of against the interests of people in Ethiopia. Um, and it's so interesting that a movement that is rooted in freedom, in justice, in peaceful protests, where these Gero and Kare, these young Oromo men and women would walk out into the streets of Oromia and face off against guns, against rifles, against bombs, against whatever it may be, with, their bare hands. They would just stand there, with their bodies to oppose this weaponized oppression, because they were that determined to achieve freedom. They were that determined to be free of this oppression. It's like
Yeah.
it's difficult to comprehend how hard it is to live somewhere, to be somewhere where it is your home, it's your indigenous, your ancestral lands. That is the one place in the world where you belong, but you do not have the space to exist as who you are.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the capacity to be Oromo in the ancestral indigenous lands of Oromo people. There is such a fundamental oppression in that. There is such a psychological sort of torture in that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where people are willing to put their lives on the line to escape from it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's just it's one of those things that is just another strain um, of being Oromo in Ethiopia, um, and fighting against so many narratives from so many angles to have your voice heard. Fighting against the narrative of Ethiopian exceptionalism, and fighting against the narrative, against the sort of unitary Ethiopianist narrative, and fighting against the narrative that demonizes Oromo people, because demonizing Oromo people has been a tactic to oppress and subjugate and marginalize Oromo people since the foundation of the Ethiopian Empire. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when you're fighting, when you're fighting on so many fronts, it's almost like, which way do you turn?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of people who are against the self-determination of nations and nationalities, um, really try to minimize that fight or that, struggle for autonomy and freedom. They try to make it seem like some sort of ethnic tribalist, you know, thing of the past. But that is such a dismissal of, number one, it's a dismissal of who people are. And it shows that you don't really believe in unity because people are telling you what they need and what they want, and you say, no, 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 I don't care about that. You want what I want, and that's all you get, and you're going to shut up
Mm,
and you're going to be happy about it, and you're never going to talk about all that stuff again because we don't want that. That's what they're telling you.
mm,
Um, and then on top of that, to say that it's so beneath them to talk about ethnicity and all that, but really that only comes, and we say nations and nationalities because we like Oromos are a nation. It's not simply like an ethnic group or a tribe. And, we're a diverse nation. We share one language, but we have so much diversity within us. And it's that dismissal, but then when it's convenient, ethnicity comes up. But it's
mm,
only when it's convenient. And it's like that weaponization of people's identities, that I think Ethiopia is a repressive state in general. As we said, there's not freedom of speech, there's not free press. Um, you know, there are state sanctioned killings, random, unlawful arrests and detainments all the time. But it's really what's at the core of it is that identity aspect. And so it's convenient for the unitarist, like people pushing that like one Ethiopian identity mentality, um, want you to assimilate, and they also just want to weaponize your identity when it's convenient for them.
mm,
Um, and that's all to mask that what they want is to push one singular identity upon everyone
mhm,
else.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
Hope that made sense. I think I went on a tangent a little bit.
No, 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 it made sense. I mean, this is just a free-flowing conversation, so tangents are definitely welcome. But yeah, I think how we mentioned commented something similar, saying that the assimilationist, oh gosh, the assimilationist mentality is sickening, and that that's the core of it, isn't it? That there is this assimilationist mentality, and everything that doesn't fit within that particular paradigm has to be erased or put to the side for the Ethiopian project to be successful. Um, so, right. I mean, since the killing of Hachalu Hundessa on the 29th of June, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
of this year. And Hachalu was an extremely beloved Oromo artist. His music really successfully encapsulated the Oromo consciousness, and he was able to so beautifully express, you know, the feelings and the mind and the thoughts of the Oromo nation, and he was really an icon to the Oromo people, and he was a living legend, at his young age of, I believe he was 35. Was he 35 or 36?
34, yeah.
34, yeah. So, even at the age of 34, he was already an icon for the Oromo people, and he had already made such a mark on Oromo culture and Oromo society. And he was killed because he spoke out against the repressive Ethiopian regime, and he spoke out against the glorification of Ethiopia's imperial history. So those were the reasons for his death. The fact that he spoke out against the glorification of Ethiopia, and the sort of the Ethiopian empire and that colonial imperial history, and also criticizing Abiy and the current government. And as soon as he was killed, the following day, the top Oromo political leadership was imprisoned, like we mentioned earlier, and have been imprisoned ever since. And in the months that have followed, Oromo people have been persecuted by federal forces. They have been. Oh, my battery is dying. But it's okay. I can put my phone on charge. Oromo people have been persecuted by federal forces. They have been killed. Ooh, let me just plug the charger in. Excuse the interruption. Yeah, they've been persecuted by the government in every single way that you can imagine. Like we said earlier, thousands of Oromo protesters who came out to protest after Hajalu was killed and after Oromo political leadership were imprisoned. Thousands of people who came out to protest were arbitrarily detained. The estimates of how many people are imprisoned range from anywhere between 5 to 15,000. People don't even really know how many people have been in prison. People have just disappeared without a trace. Nobody knows where some people are. They can't, once people have been detained, their families aren't able to find them. They aren't able to trace them. They don't know whether they're dead or alive.
There are tens of thousands of just Oromo political prisoners in Ethiopia right now. Tens of thousands.
Exactly. Schools were turned into prisons. This is all during COVID-19, mind you. In this pandemic, the Ethiopian government has been filling up cells, hundreds of people in one cell, just packing them like sardines in prisons in the middle of a pandemic. And putting that into perspective, this is the same pandemic that they gave as an excuse not to hold an election for. So they refused to hold elections because of COVID-19. But they have no problem packing people into prisons, into schools, into any physical building that can be used for detainment in the midst of this pandemic. So
it's really so sad. I mean, obviously there are so many people that, some of them we don't even know their names. Even they get arrested and the people who arrest them don't even know their actual names. They just get arrested. They don't get charged. So many of them don't even get charged, don't even there's no due process of any kind. They're imprisoned in schools, anywhere. Police stations for months. Doctors that are the only healthcare providers in their rural area, women that are in prison with their children. It's devastating, honestly. And these are people and this is a tactic that they use to suppress the movement, because these people, a lot of them, maybe young people that are, the ones who are sacrificing, again, their safety, their personal safety, and even their lives in a lot of cases. And because of that is the strength of the people, because, Oromia and Oromo people are completely disarmed. The government has ensured that they don't have a way to protect themselves. And so, what they use to fight for freedom is their body, themselves protesting and risking their lives. And the widespread mass imprisonment of people for political reasons is one huge aspect of Abiy's war on civilians right now.
Exactly. And there are reports every single day of people being taken out of prison and being executed and left in the open. Um, so for whatever reason, they're just taken out from their cells, shot dead, left in the bushes, left in the street, dumped in rivers. Every single day, people are being found having been executed arbitrarily by federal forces, and it won't stop. It simply won't stop. And this is what we do know. We have no idea what's going on where there are communication shutdowns. We have no idea what's going on in Wallaga. We have no idea what's going on in areas of Hararge. We have regions in Oromia. We have no idea what's going on in Tigray. There, these places where there are these communication shutdowns, God knows what's happening to civilians in these areas. And, Tigray has been shelled over, the last day or so. There's been reports of shelling in the Tigray region. In a city, in the city of Makala, which has a population of 500,000 people. So, you can only imagine the kind of carnage that's being caused by these operations by the federal government.
Yeah. And then, like, the way that the federal government reports it as a liberation of the people, it just shows how like twisted that mindset is, that you can claim to violate people who didn't ask for you. Liberate people. I don't know what I just said. To liberate people who did not ask for you to liberate them, but do so by bombing them and shelling them. I mean, it's just this government will never, does not have the people's interests at hand, and will never be a government that's going to change anything positively. It's only going to keep getting worse. And the reality is that people have been warning of this for months, over a year. And, this is where we are, unfortunately.
Yeah. This is exactly where we are. And I guess to kind of give an example of how Ethiopia is still operating as a colonial empire, is that, and this push that Abiy Ahmed is doing to bring Ethiopia back to a more sort of centralized, unitary political system, is that when you decentralize power, when you decentralize control, that also decentralizes economic power, and it also decentralizes economic control. And the Ethiopian empire was founded on exploitation. I mean, the reason for all colonial empires really is to be able to exploit resources. That is the foundational reason for the majority of colonial empires that have existed throughout history, so that you can exploit the resources of the place that you have colonized, whether it's the human resources, whether it's, the land resources, whatever it may be. And it's the same reason with the Ethiopian empire. The empire was founded so that the ruling elite could exploit the resources of the colonized areas, of the colonized lands and the colonized nations. And so if power is then decentralized from the current Ethiopian government, and considering the fact that Oromia in particular is one of the most resource-rich regions in Ethiopia. The nation of Oromia has extremely fertile lands, has a lot of mineral resources, has a lot of water resources. So Oromia is a resource-rich region, a resource-rich nation. And decentralizing that power causes a loss of control over these resources. So the push for Abiy to centralize, to bring power back to the center, to consolidate more power for the federal government, is to be able to consolidate control over those resources and therefore strengthen the federal government and the ruling elite that are in control of the federal government economically. So essentially the same motivations today as the motivations behind the empire, 150 years ago, or whatever it was at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.